Hi, everybody from all over. I'm coming to you from Ceylan, from the Galileo, from the Galilee. And I'm really excited to be here. This is the first in a series of shiurim on the deep backstories of Megillat Esther. Now, I want to explain first what I mean by that before we jump into our first deep backstory. What this shiur is not, what this series is not, is a series on the story of the Megillah itself. It is not a close literary analysis or a philosophical read or any other type of read of Megillat Esther, of the book of Esther. There are other opportunities, I'm sure, to get that. There's what it is also not a series on the shallow backstories of Megillat Esther. What do I mean by that? Esther, as with many books in Tanakh, comes to address earlier stories in the Bible and either to further them along or to somehow offer a response to earlier stories. So, for example, one of the common, what I call shallow stories of Megillat Esther is how Esther and Mordechai, who are descendants of King Saul, of Hamelech Shaul, come and address the failings of King Shaul. So that's kind of a limited story in that they're clearly coming to deal with an earlier failing, and they will come and affect a tikkun, a repairing of that failing. But the stories that we're going to be dealing with for the next month and a half, 5 weeks, are stories that go far deeper in Tanakh. And these are stories that are obliquely addressed in the Megillah. What do I mean by that? I mean that we're not going to find them directly addressed the way that the shallow stories, such as Mordechai and Esther coming to heal the failings of Shaul, are addressed. These stories, these characters, whether we're talking about Esav or whether we are talking about but Bil'am or Rachel, these are characters that surface again and again through the biblical record, but really find a very, very strong home, as it were, in the Megillah. And I'd like to take this first shiur as an exercise in that and see if I can convince you and see if it's compelling to you to start to think about the Megillah as kind of a destination of these earlier biblical stories and how they'll find themselves addressed in the Megillah. Now, I feel like I have liberty to do this because because of the sages themselves, because of Chazal, and how Chazal will link and associate earlier figures and earlier stories with the Megillah. And so if you look with me at our first source here, the first source is from Masechet Megillah, from the tractate of Megillah. And the first source is pulled from a list that appears in about a daf and a half of the Megillah, of Masechet Megillah, of the tractate. And the list is a list of sages who, when they offered their drashot, when they got up to give their sermons in their synagogues about Megillat Esther, they would open with a verse from elsewhere in the Bible, not a verse from the Megillah. So some would open with a verse from Jeremiah or from Kohelet or from Psalms. And in the case that we're going to look at, it is a verse from Yeshayahu. And these are called the Petichtot. And there's a group of around 14 Petichtot. And this Petichtot that we're going to look at is a gateway, if you will, into Rabbi Yonatan's, this particular sage's mind, when it comes to his assessment of the Megillah, or at least the main elements of the Megillah, Megillat Esther, that he wants to stress. So let's look together at his prologue. Again, one of 14 petichtot. By the way, the Gemara never explains the reason for the petichta. The Gemara just gives that opening line and never follows through with what the rest of the drasha was. So we're going to have to try and tease that out for ourselves. So let's look together at Rabbi Yonatan's petichta. Rabbi Yonatan patach le pitcha lahai parshata mehacha. Rabbi Yonatan introduced the following passage when he was launching into his sermon on Megillat Esther. And he quotes a passage from the book of Yeshayahu, the 14th chapter. Vikamti alehem, and I will rise up against them, Ne'um Hashem. I will rise up against who? Ve'ichrati lebavel, shem usha'ar v'nin v'neched, Ne'um Hashem. And I shall cut off from Babylonia. The literal translation is a name and a remnant, like She'eri Tapleta, Vinin, a descendant, V'neched, another descendant. Usually in colloquial Hebrew or modern Hebrew, Nin means a great-grandchild, and Neched is a grandchild. But the thrust of this verse is about the downfall of Babylonia. Now, this is actually quite curious because Isaiah, the prophet, lived before the rise of Babylonia. He lived in the 8th century BCE, and he was directly dealing with the threat of Assyria. But here he's prophesying not only about what will happen in a number of decades, the rise of Babylonia, but specifically this chapter, the 14th chapter of Isaiah, is about the downfall of Babylonia. So were we to just look at this verse, I think that it's very legitimate for us to ask the question, which is really the framework of this shiur, my Bavel, what does Babylonia have to do with Megillat Esther? Megillat Esther is a book that is set in the context of the Persian and Median empires, specifically in the case of Achashverosh, Xerxes, that would be the Persian Empire. So Babylonia, which was the predecessor to the Persian Empire, Babylonia, which fell around 540, 539 BCE to Cyrus, seems to be irrelevant to the Megillah. I hope you agree with me on that point. But for some reason, Rabbi Yonatan felt that this would make a remarkable and very apt introduction to his drasha on Megillat Esther. Now let's see what he does with this verse. He takes the verse and he says, this verse, which deals with the downfall of Bavel, can be divided into different elements. When God says that he's going to cut off from Bavel a name, that means that he's going to cut off Babylonian writing, maybe Babylonian script, maybe the Babylonian texts. He's going to render them irrelevant, redundant, or somehow destroy them. She'ar, cutting off the remnant of Bavel. Zelashon, he's going to render the language of Bavel irrelevant. Nin, Zemalchut, the descendant of Bavel. In this case, he's understanding as their kingdom. V'neched, so Vashti. And the further descendant, this is Vashti. Okay, so when I'm dealing with these 4 different elements, 3 of which are more categorical, or are broader, let's say, the writing and the language and the kingdom, and one is very specific, Vashti. And Vashti is kind of our pin to the Megillah, right? Because we know of as a character in the Megillah. Aside from that, I find it that I'll reiterate my first question, I'll repeat my first question, and then I'll add another question. My question for this shiur is why Rabbi Yonatan was compelled to frame the Megillat Esther, his prime drasha, his prime teaching about Megillat Esther involves the downfall of Babylonia, which had happened numerous years before the story of Achashverosh, and we're clearly very firmly set in a Persian context in the Megillah. And my second question is, if it was so important to Rabbi Yonatan to discuss the Megillah in terms of the downfall of Babylonia, why did he pick this verse? It's a verse that definitely describes the destruction of Bavel, v'hichrati leBavel, and I will destroy Bavel, but he could have chosen much better verses. Here, let's look at a couple of them. He could have chosen this passage from the book of Daniel. Now, this is a very famous passage that deals with the dream that the king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar, had. And here it is in the Aramaic. Much of Daniel is in the Aramaic language. And here I have the translation for us in the English. And it is a dream that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, who destroyed the temple and exiled the kingdom of Judah, had in his palace back in Babylonia, back in the city of Babylon. And he woke up and he wasn't able to recollect the dream. So he calls on Daniel, not only to interpret the dream, but to actually tell him what he had dreamt. I know that I had a significant dream, but I don't remember the details. And Daniel fills him in. He says, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, this was your dream. You dreamed of a massive golem, as of a huge colossus, a huge statue that was comprised of different elements. So its head was comprised of gold, and its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and further and further onto its legs, its feet, even a mixture, an admixture of iron and clay. And he then goes on, after describing what happens to this colossus, which is a stone is hurled at the colossus, and the colossus dissolves, and a large mountain grows in its place. Now Daniel interprets the dream, and he says, you, Nebuchadnezzar, king of kings, into his hands have been given all of creation. You represent the head of gold, but another kingdom will arise beneath you. That would be the shoulders of silver. That would be Persia, and they will destroy you. And then a kingdom will arise after Persia, Alexander of Macedon, and the Hellenistic Empire, and they will destroy Persia in turn, etc., etc. The whole development of various subsequent kingdoms. So this might have been a nice text for Rabbi Yonatan to have used, because it's very lyrical, and it's full of lovely imagery. I don't know, so lovely, but imagery of the destruction of Babylonia. Or were he to want to be more pithy and go straight to the point, he could have gone to probably the most direct text about the downfall of Babylonia. And we're familiar with this text just from general Jewish history classes, a text from Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah was a prophet who lived during the destruction of the first temple and the exile of the Judeans by the Babylonians. And Jeremiah says the following: Beit David, Ho Amar Hashem, Dinu Laboker Mishpat. God says, render just verdicts morning by morning. Vatsilu gazul miyado shek. I did not bring the right verse here. So this is not the verse that I meant to bring. Trust me on this. The verse that I meant to bring, which is in the same chapter, is about the downfall of Bavel in 70 years' time, right? Were we to go to Yirmiyahu Chaf Aleph, I can load it up here. Maybe it's in a different chapter, but there is a verse in Yirmiyahu within this context that deals with the imminent, or let's say in a number of decades, Babylonia will be destroyed in 70 years' time. Though they have done you great harm, they will eventually be destroyed. And another temple, second temple, will arise in place of the first temple. Okay, so for whatever reason, Rabbi Yonatan chose to pick this verse in Isaiah, in Yeshayahu, and he did not choose the alternatives in Daniel and in Yirmiyahu, which would have been much more direct, let's say, or less oblique with this idea of destroying Bavel. But I believe that Rabbi Yonatan chose this verse because of the possibilities of interpreting these verses, Shem, Sha'ar, Nin, V'neched. That it was very important to Rabbi Yonatan not only to say Babylonia is going to be destroyed and Persia will rise in its place, but that specific elements of Babylonia are going to be rendered obsolete. And those elements are its writing, its language, its government or its administration, and its whatever physical remnants are left of Babylonia will also be destroyed. Vashti, which links us again to the Megillah. And it's at this point that I want to just show you, so you don't have to take it on my word, that Vashti was considered a descendant of the Babylonian kings. And so Achashverosh, in marrying Vashti, is doing essentially what Herod did in marrying Mariamne, the Hasmonean princess. Here you have, and it's happened in many iterations throughout history, where you have a ruler who is looking to cement his rule. And so he marries a member of the royal family from the kingdom that he has destroyed or defeated, or from the previous kingdom. So here in Masechet Megillah, Vashti Harasha bat bino shel Nebuchadnezzar Harasha. Understand that Vashti is from the stock of the Babylonians, and she, in a strategic marriage, marries the king of the Persians, Achashverosh. Now, I think that it's important at this time to understand the concept in order to get to what Rabbi Yonatan is driving at with the destruction of the language and the script and the government of Babylonia. It's very important to understand the concept of Babylonia. When I say Babylonia, I'm misspeaking. If I were to put on my historian's hat here, then to be very accurate, when we're talking about the kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, who we know of through Tanakh, add to them Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabonidus, and Nabopolassar, and kings of this dynasty, of this particular dynasty, the kings who were responsible for the exile of the Jewish people, the kings who were responsible for the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian kings. They were not Babylonian kings. They were Neo-Babylonian kings. Their kingdom was a reimagining of a much more ancient kingdom. And when I say this, I'm not only drawing from rabbinic opinion on the matter. I'll start with rabbinic opinion, but then again, I will switch off between my Beit Midrash hat, my Talmud Torah hat, so to speak, and my historian hat, because I think that the two very, very often are on the same hat rack in my house, at least, where I utilize them in tandem to try and arrive at a deeper truth. What do I mean? If we look in Masechet Pesachim, and we're trying to understand Nebuchadnezzar, and we're trying to Nebuchadnezzar as the prime king of Neo-Babylonia, of this era from the late 600s, meaning around 624 BCE or slightly afterwards, to around the 540s BCE. Then Nebuchadnezzar is the dominant figure. And how do the sages perceive of him? Nebuchadnezzar, Rasha ben Rasha. Nebuchadnezzar was wholly evil. Ben Beno shel Nimrod harasha. Oh, okay. He was a descendant of sorts, or a Ben Beno, a disciple of Nimrod harasha. Ben or a bat does not necessarily only mean a child. It means someone who is in the image of. My daughter's name is Bat Chen, which means embodiment of grace. She's not the daughter of a graceful person. I'm not very graceful, but the name Ben or Bat, the term, means embodiment of. Ben Beno shel Nimrod harasha. Nebuchadnezzar was made in the model of Nimrod, Shehimrid et kol ha'olam kulo alai b'malchuto, who caused the entire world to rebel against God during his reign. Now, what this means conceptually, because Midrash should never be understood literally, is that in the mind of the sages, this king Nebuchadnezzar, who preceded the Persian kingdom, was of the same cut. He was cut from the same cloth. He envisioned himself as a Nimrod redo, as another Nimrod. If you were to look at all of the, not all, but a good deal of the academic literature on the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the empire of Nebuchadnezzar, then you would see a very, very clear program of a kingdom that saw themselves as direct heirs of a very long tradition of the Babylonian civilization. They rooted their self-concept, they drew their legends from well over 1,000 years before their inception, meaning they thought of themselves as another Hammurabi, as another Sargon, as another Naram-Sin. And these are kings who lived well before the patriarchs. These are kings who were the kings of the old Sumerian and Akkadian kingdoms, or specifically in the case of Hammurabi, we can say the old Babylonian kingdom. All right, let's take a look. Here's an inscription commissioned by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, these are the years of Nebuchadnezzar, and you can see that the double exile of Judea, the first one being the exile of the elite, the Galut Choreshu Masker in 597 BCE, as well as the Galut of the exile of Judea in 586 BCE, all happened in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now look at this tablet that he commissioned. And in this tablet, you see that the script is cuneiform. It's an ancient script that had been developed well over 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar. And he resurrected the language of ancient Babylonia, meaning that he brought Akkadian back into fashion. If the lingua franca, the spoken language of that time, was Aramaic, he, in his royal documents and all official commissioned literature or communication, insisted on Akkadian, because he saw himself in the person of Hammurabi. In fact, he also excavated. He was the world's first archaeologist. He excavated the ancient temples of Marduk and of Enlil and of these very ancient Babylonian gods, and built and rebuilt them, because what he was saying was that through my invocation of this ancient lineage, we are celebrating our past, and we are thinking of ourselves in that mind. He claimed ancient titles, the same titles that were claimed by the ancient kings of Sargon and Hammurabi. And you can see here one of his many works in the city of Babylon, which he rebuilt, the city that was originally built back 1,000+ years earlier in the age of ancient Babylonia. The Neo-Babylonians kings of the late 7th and 6th centuries rebuilt this ancient kingdom, and this is the Ishtar Gate, celebrating the ancient goddess Ishtar. It's now, I believe, in Germany. So it was excavated by the Germans. Not only that, there's another wonderful intersection that our sages bring, that is somewhat corroborated by history or legend, where the whole outlook of the Neo-Babylonians was made in the fashion of the far more ancient Babylonians. By the way, in the same way that, let's say, to bring a more better known example, when Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope in the year 800, he was crowned as the Emperor of the Romans. But there was no Rome in the 9th century Common Era, correct? But the new Holy Roman Empire fashioned itself or thought of itself, conceived of itself in the model of a far more ancient Roman Empire and saw itself as a continuation of that empire. By the way, the Third Reich also saw itself as a continuation from the Second Reich and the First Reich being the Roman Empire. So my argument is that the Neo-Babylonians saw themselves as inheritors of a far more ancient Babylonian tradition. One more very interesting intersection before we go on and bring this back to our Megillah is in the person that is known to us through at least the Greek texts as Semiramis. Semiramis is a woman, and she appears twice in rabbinic literature. First, she appears in the Midrashic work of Esther Rabbah, where the Midrash is talking about 4 very, very powerful women who were not just queen consorts, but were queens in their own right. And 3 of them we know about through the Bible. Izebel and Atalia we know about through the book of Kings. Vashti we know about through the book of Esther. And then we have a 4th one here, Shmiramit, who we don't really know anything, we definitely don't know about through the Bible, but doesn't really seem to figure in Jewish history either. Another source, another rabbinic source, midrashic source in Vayikra Rabbah, gives us an identity to this Shmiramit and says Shmiramit was none other than the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. Rav Huna Amar Shmira Shema. Her name was Shmira, and Rav Avin says no, her name was really Shmiramot or Shmiraam. Some version of Shmiramit was the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. And Shmiramit has become a very well-known figure in the world of Western art because legends have developed around Shmiramit, or Semiramis, not as the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, but as the wife of Nimrod, or as the wife of a far earlier Babylonian king. Again, the first kingdom of Babylon from the 2nd millennium BCE, from 1,000 years before Neo-Babylonia. So indirectly here, by assigning Shmiramit to Nebuchadnezzar as his wife, the sages are once again reinforcing the concept of Neo-Babylonia, led by Nebuchadnezzar, as remaking the far more ancient kingdom of Babylonia, where Shmiramit was the wife of Nimrod. So my argument is that if we're going to try and understand Rabbi Yonatan and his Petichta, and why he was so obsessed with the downfall of Babylonia in considering Megillat Esther, the concept of Megillat Esther, then I think that we don't only need to be looking at Neo-Babylonia, meaning the Babylonia of Nebuchadnezzar. We need to be looking at the model that Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as a continuation and direct heir from. And that is Nimrod. Nimrod, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them at the end of this year. Nimrod is not a historical figure. Nimrod is a figure that is a biblical figure. Now, I want to be very careful here. When I say that he's not a historical figure, that doesn't mean that he didn't exist. It means that we, as of yet, do not have any extra biblical attestation or evidence of a figure named Nimrod. But Nimrod seems to, in a way, be a composite of a number of ancient Babylonian kings. Nimrod comes to us by way of the book of Genesis, and he is the figure, the exemplar of ancient Babylonia. And from him, we can learn quite a lot about Nebuchadnezzar's agenda. So let's look at what we know about Nimrod. Here in the 10th chapter of Genesis, we are in the table of nations. We have a list of 70 nations that descended from Noach after the flood. V'kush yalad et Nimrod, hu hechel liot gibor ba'aretz. Cush, who we associate normally with a descendant of Ham, Cush meaning an area within Africa and of that lineage. Most scholars consider, in this case, Cush to be a city not related to Ham, but a city in Babylonia, which is in the area of Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, or Akkad, Sumer, those lands. There was a city known as Cush as well. And this Cush gave birth to Nimrod, or the figure who founded the city of Cush, born Nimrod. He began to be a mighty figure on the earth. Hu haya gibor tzayid lifnei Hashem. Al Kenya, American Nimrod gibor tzayid lifnei Hashem. He was a mighty hunter. Hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of God. This seems to be a complementary description of Nimrod, someone who was a gibor, someone who was a hunter before God. God's name is mentioned. V'tihi reshit mamlachto Bavel, va'erech, va'akad, v'chalnei, be'eretz Shinar. And in the English translation here, the mainstays of his kingdom, or the main cities of his kingdom, were Bavel, Erech or Uruk, Akkad, we know from which came the language of Akkadian. Kalne is a city that's almost impossible to identify, in the land of Shinar. These are cities that we know about outside of the biblical record as well: the city of Babylon, the city of Uruk, the city of Akkad, the valley of Shinar, the land of Shinar, all cities in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia. I'm sorry, I thought that I had a map here, but it seems to have disappeared. And these were cities that were either founded by or strengthened by Nimrod. So I just want to place us again. We're talking about the 19th, 18th centuries BCE, 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if we were to look at the rabbinic understanding of this personality, a rabbinic snapshot of how Chazal, how our sages viewed Nimrod, it would not be very complimentary. They take each one of these terms, liot gibor ba'aretz, and he was a gibor tzayid, and they interpret it negatively. They said, what does it mean that he was a strong man? Strong man, and here Rashi is quoting here from Bereshit Rabbah, from the Midrashic work of Genesis Rabbah, Lahamrid kol ha'olam al hakadosh baruch hu ba'atzat dor ha'haflaga, that he caused the entire world to rebel against God in the age of the Dor Hafalaga, which is the age of the Migdal Babel, of the Tower of Babel, and the dispersion in the wake of that Tower of Babel. Rashi will go on to say more negative things about Nimrod. Not only did he cause everyone to rebel against God, Tzad da'atan shel briot befiv. What does it mean that he was a hunter or an entrapper? He entrapped or ensnared the minds of people by his words. He was charismatic. He was a magnificent speaker. He misled them to rebel against God. Umat'an limrod b'makom. He was a very, very gifted orator who led them astray. Before God, going back to our verse here, that he was a hunter before God, also interpreted negatively by the sages, that he intended to provoke God to his face, and therefore people would speak about him in a pejorative sense. He became a buzzword for a wicked person. You act poorly, then you are Kinimrod Gibor Tzayed. You're just like Nimrod. It wasn't a complimentary name at all. So in the sage's estimation, Nimrod is a very negative character, and they expand this to the storyline in the Bible. Now, the main story that takes place after the flood is the story of the building of the Tower of Babel, the Migdal Bavel, and the subsequent dispersal, because the tower, this building enterprise, was a danger to humanity, and God put an end to it and dispersed all those who were involved in the enterprise. What our sages will do is they will rope Nimrod into the story. Nowhere in the story does Nimrod appear. But because Nimrod is the king over Bavel, which is where the story takes place, and it takes place in the land of Shinar, and he is given this identity as a very powerful and charismatic individual, then the sages will say Nimrod was the ringleader of the Tower of Babel project. And here you can just read for yourself. I have it. I'm not going to read it together with you, but in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, we can see that Nimrod is the one who is leading this enterprise. You see here in the actual text of the story of the building of the Tower of Babel, that it takes place in Eretz Shinar. So because we're dealing with the Tower of Babel, and it's taking place in the land of Shinar, and Nimrod is known as the king of Babel in the land of Shinar, it's legitimate from a textual standpoint to claim that Nimrod is the head of this building enterprise. Now, through considering the story of the building of Babel, we can arrive at what the Neo-Babylonian Empire thought of itself. Again, I'm making a series of logical connections here. If the Neo-Babylonian Empire considered itself a Gilgul, how do you say Gilgul? A reimagining, right, or a reincarnation of a hoary, ancient, much earlier Babylonian Empire, then we have to look at the self-concept of that original Babylonian Empire to understand what Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonians were seeking to do. So what Nimrod sought to do in his building of Migdal Bavel is to stop the spread. He was looking at ensuring that his totalitarian control could remain intact. If, in the wake of the flood, the world had started to heterogenetize, so that's not a word, but you know what I mean, had started to spread, had started to speciate, had started to diversify, and we know this because the passages themselves tell us this. The three sons of Noah were the core, and then the world started to branch out. So me'ele nafsa kol haaretz, the world branched out. And me'ele nifredu iye hagoyim, it branched out into islands and lands and languages, ish lil shono, many different languages, many different evolutions and developments of humanity and language from the flood, from the aftermath of the flood. The sons of Cham, lemishpachotam, lil shonam, in their numerous families, in their numerous languages, in their numerous nations, in their numerous lands. And then again and again and again, you see that the verses are talking about a great spread of spreading and developing into a diversity. What the program of Migdal Bavel sought to do was to put a stop to the spread, was to homogenetize, and that's again not a word, but to standardize
That is the word. To standardize to standardize humanity and to ensure that at least in his stronghold of Babylonia, that Babylonia remained safa echat udvarim achadim, that it remained a single language with the same words, the same slogans, the same meanings, ensuring that there was control over the population. If I control the language, if I control the narrative, then I control the people. And so let us build this great tower and a great city so that we can be a stronghold, so that the strong man, the Gibor, Nimrod, could rule over his stronghold. And God said, but that's not how I designed creation. Creation is speciated. Is there only one type of cat? Is there only one type of plant? There's a great variety, a great diversity to all of creation, and a great variety and a great diversity to mankind. There should be multiple languages. There should be multiple cultures. Perhaps there should even be multiple narratives. And so God says, Vayomer Hashem, hein am echad v'safa echad lekulam. This is their agenda. This is their plan. But I will not allow that plan to stand. Havanir davin avla sham svatam. Let us go and confound their speech, so that no one shall understand the other's speech. Vayafetz Hashem otam. What God had envisioned after the Mabul, after the flood of the great spread, he once again ensured what happened, and he spread them all and confounded their speech and scattered them all over the face of the earth. Now, to get back to our story here of our initial source with Rabbi Yonatan. I'm going to go back to our first source here so that we can review it again. Rabbi Yonatan, in introducing Megillat Esther, which is a very Persian story again, he says, in order to understand Megillat Esther, you have to understand that Persia was designed and deliberately was trying to undo everything that Neo-Babylonia stood for. And Neo-Babylonia stood for the same standardization, the same single language, the same totalitarian control as its muse, ancient Babylonia. So Nebuchadnezzar as the next Nimrod, as it were, or you can say Nebuchadnezzar as the next Hammurabi, or Nebuchadnezzar as the next Sargon. Nebuchadnezzar envisioning himself or fashioning himself in the model of these ancient kings, sought to standardize language, sought to homogenize his population, sought to rule by control, sought to take away agency, sought to rule with an iron fist in a totalitarian sense. And what the undoing of Neo-Babylonia is the same undoing of the Tower of Babel. If God undid the program of ancient Babylonia by enforcing the spread, by insisting that there be a plethora of languages, a plethora of narratives, then Persia, which we know of as the Achaemenid dynasty, the dynasty of the king Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, the kings Koresh, Daryavesh, Achashverosh, Artaxerxes, these are the kings who came with a deliberate program to grant agency, to grant a certain level of autonomy, to grant a certain level of freedom to the various different populations under their control. I'll direct you here to the Cyrus cylinder. For those of you who are familiar with the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty, Cyrus. Cyrus was a king who allowed all of the various different ethnicities and minor and smaller peoples that had been standardized under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he allowed them all back to their indigenous lands, to the lands that they had come from, to rebuild their countries and to rebuild their temples. Most famous among these peoples were the Judeans, were the Jews, and we're familiar with the story from Tanakh, from the book of Ezra, and from the Cyrus Cylinder as well, where we are told that that all peoples were allowed to go back to their lands and rebuild their kingdoms. So Cyrus is launching a very different program than Nebuchadnezzar. Cyrus's program is one of allowing agency, allowing a certain measure of freedom, allowing a certain diversity, and championing that diversity, and believing perhaps that his best chance of winning his subjects' affection and love and loyalty was through affording them a certain measure of freedom. And the king Achashverosh is made in the model of his predecessors Darius and Cyrus, Daryavesh and Koresh. And let's take a look at how this plays out. From a strictly textual point of view, notice, this is something very curious about the Megillah, Megillat Esther. I'm going to bring you 3 or 4 examples here. Did you ever notice that Megillat Esther is like obsessed with language, right? And take an example from the end of the first chapter. Vayishach sarim al kol medinot hamelech. Medina kichtaba ba'am kilshono. Liot kalish sorer b'veito m'daber kilshon amo. Right? Where Achashverosh took great pains to make sure that all of the different languages in his 127 distinct provinces, not one kingdom, 127 provinces. That's a very different way of defining a kingdom, right? And that he made sure that each one was able to retain their language, that each person felt that he had autonomy in his own home, and that he could speak the language of his people. It's a very, very different program than the standardization of language that the Neo-Babylonian kings, that Nebuchadnezzar insisted on, when the only language allowed was Akkadian. And then more and more examples. For those of us who are familiar with hearing the Megillah year in, year out, this is just a cadence, and it rings. You know, it probably fell into the background because there are so many interesting details. But notice it comes up over and over again. El Medina ve'el sarei am ba'am. Medina kichtaba ba'am kilshono. Every different 127 nations, every one of them had their own script, had their own language, was able to retain that script and language. Medina kichtaba am ba'am kilshono ve'el Yehudim kichtabam kilshonam. Just as all of the other kingdoms and religions and ethnicities was allowed their script and their language, so too were the Jews allowed their script and their language. And so through the founding of the Achaemenid dynasty, the hope was, or the program, not the hope, the program was an undoing of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. It was an erasing, a destroying of the Ktav and of the Lashon. Remember, Rabbi Yonatan chose that verse in Yeshayahu deliberately because it allowed him to tease out the most important elements of Nebuchadnezzar's reign that had to be destroyed by the Achaemenid Persian dynasty empire. That it was very critical to destroy their writing and their language, because only by destroying that old model, that old totalitarian sense of control, could a brave new world emerge. A new world that would allow for autonomy, that would allow for diversity, that would allow for, and here's the point of it, that would allow for the Jewish people to understand how to live in diversity. Because Megillat Esther is a book of exile. It's a book of galut. It's a book of how the Jews can find themselves within the family of nations, with its own language, with its own script. Because only in the climate of Persia was such a thing possible. So Rabbi Yonatan, in his introduction to the Megillah, in his framing of the Megillah, states, you have to understand that this book, Megillat Esther, is about the experience of the Jewish people in exile and how they will figure out and learn to find their own concept, their own self-concept, their own definition, their own character, not within their land and not within their own their self-rule, but within the family of nations. And that was a reality that was provided for them by the downfall of Neo-Babylonia, by the downfall of a kingdom that celebrated standardization and celebrated totalitarian rule, and the quashing and the squelching of diversity and of multiple narratives and of multiple languages and of multiple identities. Persia was one that celebrated the multiple languages and identities of the various different peoples in its kingdom. I don't have time now to get to the midrashic material that corroborates this concept that is played out, as you see in the verses, where the verses again talk about the multiplicity of languages and scripts. But the midrash, the sustained midrash on Achashverosh specifically, and on his agenda, his governing agenda, was a populist agenda, was to try and please everyone, to allow everyone a sense of autonomy, and lasot kirtzon ish va'ish, to do as each man wished, and through that he sought to rule through winning the love and loyalty of his people. I will end this year with a final thought in this same vein. When you have a Jewish people that are entering into an entirely new reality, then the Jewish people need a leadership that can guide them through that reality. Megillat Esther marks a new reality for the Jewish people. They are no longer autonomous. They are no longer self-ruling. They are no longer in their own land. They no longer have a temple. And they have to try and find themselves in this new reality, which will span millennia, Second Temple, hiccups not included. It's very similar to one can argue, the new reality of the Jewish people over the last 80 years, having to discover itself and its new character, its new personality, once again, having self-rule in its own land. It's a process, but it takes a strong leadership, and it takes a specific leadership. And in the case of the Jewish people in the Achaemenid Empire, in the empire of ancient Persia, the leader was Mordechai. Mordechai was one who is described in the book of Ezra as Mordechai Bilshan. Now, don't look at this translation, because this translation is one version of understanding the people who were exiled by the Babylonians, but who then returned to Judah after Cyrus, the Persian Median king, allowed the nations to return to their lands. One of the leaders who returned was named Mordechai. And according to this translation, it's two different names, Mordechai, Bilshan, two different people. But the sages say, no. Don't understand these as Mordechai and someone else named Bilshan. This was a person named Mordechai, and Bilshan is his descriptive. It describes the character of Mordechai. And I'm just going to end with the two rabbinic sources that go into this concept of saying who Mordechai was by way of Bilshan. And one of them is a Mishnah in the tractate Shkalim, which lists the officials in the temple. And one of these officials was named Petachia, but Petachia is another name for Mordechai. Why was Mordechai called Petachia? Shahaya poteach bidvarim vidorshan, that he would elucidate difficult topics and interpret them. V'yodea shiv'im lashon, and he was a polyglot. He was one who knew all of the languages. Now, Gverotai v'rabotai, to know all of the languages is not, in my estimation here, meant to be taken literally. It means that here you had someone who was extraordinarily facile with understanding different cultures, different narratives, and yes, different languages, because language is always a gateway to culture. Language is highly symbolic. So when Mordechai overheard the murmurings of Bigtan and Teresh, was it that he understood their language? Perhaps they were speaking in a foreign tongue, but perhaps he also understood their symbolism, what they were trying to hint to each other about their nefarious plan to execute Achashverosh. Mordechai, Balshan, is someone, and I'll end here with this last source, the commentary of the Bartanura on our Mishnah. He was someone who could bolel lishonot harbe, mix up many languages. What a beautiful concept. Someone who was very capable of understanding what was meant by each narrative as it was transmitted in each individual language. We know that were you to take a look, let's say at a document that was translated into numerous different languages, the document would read slightly differently based on each language and its symbolism. So who better to nurture and guide the Jewish people through the land, through the experience of incipient exile, through the experience of learning their way through exile, than Mordechai Bilshan, the one who was most able to appreciate the diversity of language and of culture, and most able, therefore, to act within the Achaemenid Persian context. So we're reaching the last 3 minutes of our shiur. I'm yucky that I am. I always like to give a full hour, and then I will look at the questions. I'd just like to give a summary of what today's shiur was about. This deep backstory of Megillat Esther is based on the Petichta of Rabbi Yonatan, one of the 14 prologues that is offered by the sages to the Megillah, to the book of Esther. Rabbi Yonatan deliberately chose this verse from Isaiah about the downfall of Babylonia, because it was critical in his estimation that we frame the Megillah in terms of the downfall of Babylonia, because that delivers the concept of the Megillah. Babylonia, in the case of Rabbi Yonatan's Petichta, is Neo-Babylonia, the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire to Persia, led by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar thinking of himself in the model of ancient Babylonia, the original Babylonian kingdom, led by Nimrod, or Nimrod again as that figurehead that symbolizes for us the Tfisa Olamit, the mindset of ancient Babylonia, which is a mindset of intense standardization, of singular language, of control via language and via script, and of a control via government, and the undoing of that program, either in the case of the undoing of Migdal Babel by God, or the undoing of the program of Neo-Babylonia by the Achaemenid Persian Empire, is to destroy the Shem, meaning the script, the standardized script of Akkadian, to destroy the Sha'ar, Lashon, the standardized language of Akkadian, and allow for a diversity and multiplicity of language, to destroy the Nin, that is the totalitarian rule of Neo-Babylonia, and to allow for a certain level of autonomy among the 127 provinces of the Achaemenid Empire, and to destroy the Neched, to destroy the last vestige of royalty to emerge from the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and that is Vashti. So with that, I'm happy to take questions now. And just to remind everyone, one last line of summary, that this petichta, were we to leave it with the way that it's left in the tractate, we wouldn't be able to arrive at what Rabbi Yonatan, I hope, or I believe, was trying to transmit to us, which is the importance of understanding the fall of Babylonia, that it is no longer, and we are in a brave new world that we are still, up to our day, trying to navigate, of diversity, of multiplicity of narrative, and finding our space within the family of nations. So I will go to the questions now. I hope everybody heard me okay. Varda asks, is this Sumerian or Akkadian? The language of ancient Babylonia was Akkadian. Sargon was a king of ancient Sumer. I threw his name around quite a bit. He lived in the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. Sumerian came before Akkadian did, but Neo-Babylonia, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, he championed Akkadian, and he insisted that all contact within his kingdom be in Akkadian within cuneiform script. What was the Second Reich? Carol, you asked. I believe that it was in the 19th century in Germany. There was a heyday of German rule, but don't quote me on that because that's not something I know too much about. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Shalom. Second Reich was in the 19th century. Okay. We have no extra biblical sources attesting to the historical existence of the Avot and Imahot. And this is true. Some say Nimrod is the name, but again, I just want to, Seymour, to your point, I just want to insist on remembering that just because we have not yet found, and it's very highly unlikely that and it happens very rarely, that we're able to corroborate individual figures from Tanakh with extra biblical material, with the exception of kings and some other historical figures. That doesn't mean that they themselves were not historical figures. Okay, some say Nimrod is the name of an idol. And by the way, if anyone feels they need to leave now, then please do. It was really a pleasure. I just want to make sure to get to these questions for everyone. Some say Nimrod is the name of an idol. I heard that Nimrod is some kind of a composite of Naram Sin, who was the grandson of Sargon, a hoary ancient mythological figure. Nimrod could stand for this world view, could stand as the symbol of ancient Babylonia. And I think that it's legitimate to understand him as such. Was Moses' wife a descendant of Nimrod, the son of Cush, Tzipporah? I don't know. Not familiar with that idea of Midian. Are you getting it? I wonder if you're connecting Midian to Cush here. I argued that Cush, and I apologize, I don't know what happened to my map, but it was on the source sheet, that the Cush that we're talking about is not in Africa. The Cush connected to Nimrod is a city right near ancient Babylon. So I named Kish, perhaps connected to the ancient kingdom of the Kassites. So I think that Nimrod is more likely to have been from Kish or Cush than connected to Cham. It doesn't make, or the African nations, it doesn't make any sense in terms of the geography. Yes, you can have my email. Balshan is the modern Hebrew word for detective. He who can dig deep into what someone is really saying. Well, what do you really mean by that? Linguist, yes. Okay, Rashi, Nimrod was missing from source sheet on link and email. I will do my best to standardize, although, I know that's a loaded word after the shiur. The sources I like to include pictures and media when I can. So some of that didn't even make it to my page. I'm not sure why, but I will be doing my best in the future to get you those source sheets the same way that you will see them on our screen today. It was really a pleasure. And just why did Haman use the Jews' individuality? An excellent question. We'll get to that in just 1 second. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Thank you, Amalia, exactly. And this is the last question, I believe. Why did Haman use the Jews' individuality against them? Yeshno am echad mefuzar u'meforad bein ha'amim. Haman we will be talking about in a subsequent shir as not representative of the Persian kingdom and the Achaemenid kingdom specifically. Persia is just too general of a term. Let's be very specific. The Achaemenid kingdom and their program, which was an undoing, dismantling of Neo-Babylonia. Haman is much more representative of Amalek and what Amalek brings, the specific the specific brand of evil, let's say, that Amalek introduces into this Achaemenid kingdom is separate from Achashverosh's agenda. So I hope to address, Shoshana, I hope to address your question more fully in a subsequent shir both on Bil'am and on Esav, where there will be broader discussions of Amalek. So if anyone, I'm going to leave my my email here. If anybody would like to be in touch via email, I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'll also leave my phone number. If you'd like to be in touch on WhatsApp, I'm happy to continue the conversation. Always happy to talk Torah. I'll take it from there, and we'll see you all next week. It was really a pleasure.